The Galactic Council chamber stretched wide enough to hold representatives from 247 species, and on this particular morning, humanity was once again being told to wait. Ambassador Peter Cole sat in the human delegation booth and watched the Kresh representative stomp around the speaking floor like he owned the place. Warlord Thex was doing what he always did, which was making demands and expecting everyone to bow down and accept them. The massive reptilian creature stood 3 meters tall and had scales that gleamed under the chamber lights. His voice boomed through the translation systems as he declared that another human surveyed system was actually ancient Kresh territory. Peter had heard this speech before. The words changed, but the meaning stayed the same. The Kresh wanted something that belonged to someone else, and they would take it unless someone stopped them. For the past 50 years, that someone else had usually been humanity. The Kresh seemed to enjoy pushing humans more than any other species. They would send their warships into human space, claim navigation errors, and dare anyone to challenge them. They would plant flags on asteroids that human miners had been working for years. They would buzz human cargo vessels just to watch them scatter. And every single time humanity filed formal protests and requested arbitration, and accepted whatever compromise the Council suggested. Peter had personally negotiated away 17 resource-rich systems in the past decade alone. Each time he smiled and shook hands or claws or tentacles and pretended that giving up what was rightfully human territory was actually a victory for diplomacy. The other species saw this as proof that humans were soft. They whispered in the corridors that humanity would accept anything to avoid conflict. Peter heard these whispers and said nothing. Back on Earth, the government received his reports and responded the same way every time. Accept the compromise. Keep the peace. Don't give them a reason to escalate. Peter followed his orders because that was what ambassadors did. But some nights he lay awake wondering if there would ever be a line that Earth wouldn't let him cross. Out on the frontier, Captain Jake Morrison was beginning to wonder the same thing. His ship, the Horizon's Edge, was currently on day 40 of a mapping mission along the border between human and Kresh space. The border kept shifting, always in the same direction. Human territory got smaller while Kresh territory expanded. Jake had watched it happen system by system, and each time his requests to file formal protests were denied by higher command. They told him to complete his surveys and avoid incidents. Lieutenant Lisa Grant stood beside him on the bridge, reviewing the latest sensor data. She had been his diplomatic officer for 6 years, and in that time she had talked them out of 47 potential fights. Lisa was good at her job. She knew exactly what to say to make aggressive patrol captains back down. She knew how to turn insults into misunderstandings and provocations into simple mistakes. Jake valued her skills, but sometimes wished they weren't necessary quite so often. The Kresh patrol ship had been following them for 3 days now. It stayed just outside weapons range but made no attempt to hide its presence. Every few hours, the Kresh captain would hail them and ask invasive questions about their mission. Where were they going? What were they scanning? Who had authorized their presence in this region? Lisa answered each question with perfect diplomatic courtesy, while Jake's jaw muscles worked overtime. The thing that bothered Jake most was how predictable it had all become. The Kresh would push. Humans would give ground. The Kresh would push harder. Humans would give more ground. It was a pattern that had been repeating for decades, and Jake could not see how it would ever end well. You could only retreat so far before you ran out of space to retreat into. On the colony world of New Haven, Administrator Claire Bennett was having similar thoughts. She stood in her office on the 45th floor of the administration building and looked out at the city spreading below. 50,000 people called New Haven home now. They had farms and schools and hospitals. They had lives and families and futures. And just outside the system, a Kresh battle group had taken up permanent residence. The warships appeared 6 months ago and never left. They didn't enter the system, which would have been an act of war, but they didn't need to. Their presence was message enough. New Haven was on the list of systems the Kresh claimed as ancestral territory. Claire had read their justification, which involved an archaeological survey from 300 years ago that supposedly proved Kresh settlers had visited the planet once. The evidence was thin enough to see through, but evidence didn't matter when you had the bigger guns. Claire sent weekly reports to Earth requesting additional defense platforms or at least a permanent naval presence. The responses were always the same. Resources were limited. Tensions must not be escalated. The situation was being monitored. She had stopped believing those reassurances around month 3. The colonists were starting to ask questions. They saw the Kresh ships on their long-range scans. They heard the rumors spreading through the civilian networks. Some were already packing up and requesting transport off-world. Claire couldn't blame them, but watching people abandon their homes because humanity wouldn't defend them made her sick to her stomach. Back at the Galactic Council, Peter was listening to Warlord Thex wrap up his speech. The Kresh was demanding that humans evacuate New Haven within 60 days to allow proper archaeological surveys to take place. It was phrased as a scientific request, but everyone in the chamber knew what it really meant. The council would debate for weeks. They would form committees and request impact studies. Eventually, they would suggest a compromise, where humanity gave up New Haven in exchange for some worthless system nobody wanted. Peter could already see how this would play out because he had seen it play out so many times before. He would argue passionately for human rights to New Haven. Other species would express concern. The Kresh would make veiled threats. The council would praise everyone for their restraint and suggest that perhaps humanity could relocate the colonists as a gesture of goodwill while the archaeological claims were properly investigated. That investigation would take years, during which time the Kresh would move in permanently. By the time any findings were published, it would be too late to reverse the situation. The worst part was that Peter would recommend Earth accept this compromise. He would send his report explaining that fighting over New Haven would damage humanity's reputation as peacemakers. He would argue that 50,000 relocated colonists were better than a war that could kill millions. And Earth would agree because Earth always agreed. What Peter didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that the Kresh had already decided New Haven wasn't enough. They had been testing humanity for decades, pushing boundaries and watching to see where humans would finally push back. The fact that humans never pushed back had led them to a conclusion. If humanity wouldn't fight for anything, then everything was available for the taking. The galaxy was about to learn whether that conclusion was correct. The Kresh fleet arrived at New Haven on a Tuesday morning, while most of the colony was still eating breakfast. Claire Bennett was in her office reviewing supply requisitions when her assistant ran in without knocking. The young man's face was white as paper and his hands shook as he pulled up the system defense display. 12 Kresh warships had just dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. They were moving toward New Haven at combat speed. Claire's first call was to the militia commander, a retired Navy officer named Greg Palmer, who ran the colony's minimal defense force. Greg's voice was steady when he answered, but Claire could hear the strain underneath. He told her what she already knew. The colony had 6 orbital defense platforms and maybe 20 atmospheric fighters. Against 12 warships, they would last about as long as ice cream in a furnace. Claire's second call was to Earth, and that was where things got complicated. The communication delay to Earth was 16 hours each way. Claire sent an emergency message explaining the situation and requesting immediate military support. Then, she sat in her office and waited because there was nothing else she could do. Outside her window, she could see people starting to gather in the streets as word spread. The colony's early warning systems were civilian-grade, and anyone with a scanner could see what was coming. The Kresh broadcast their demands 2 hours after arriving. Their transmission was sent on every frequency and translated into 70 languages. Warlord Thex himself appeared on the screens, his massive scaled form filling the frame. He announced that New Haven belonged to the Kresh Empire by ancient right, and all human presence must cease immediately. The colonists had 24 hours to begin evacuation procedures. Any resistance would be met with appropriate force. The transmission ended with a timer counting down. Claire called an emergency meeting of the Colony Council. 35 people crowded into the conference room, all talking at once. Some wanted to fight. Others wanted to surrender immediately. Most just wanted to know why Earth wasn't here defending them. Claire didn't have good answers for any of it. She told them about her message to Earth and explained that even if a fleet was dispatched immediately, it would take days to arrive. The Kresh had planned their timing perfectly. Greg Palmer presented their military options, which were depressing. If they fought, the orbital platforms might take out 1 or 2 Kresh ships before being destroyed. The fighters could harass the enemy but couldn't actually stop them. If the Kresh decided to bombard the colony from orbit, there was no defense. The only real question was whether dying on their feet was better than living on their knees. Claire made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her very short life. She ordered the evacuation of everyone who wanted to leave. Transport ships started loading families, children, the elderly, anyone who chose to go. But Claire also made it clear that she was staying. New Haven was humanity's colony, and someone needed to be here to hand it over properly if that was what Earth decided. She would not abandon her post. About 15,000 people chose to evacuate. That left 35,000 who either couldn't leave in time or refused to go. Some stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Others stayed because this was their home, and they would not be driven from it. Claire respected both groups equally, and did everything she could to prepare for what was coming. Captain Jake Morrison received the distress call from New Haven, while his ship was 3 days away, at maximum speed. He immediately requested permission to divert and render assistance. The response from Fleet Command took 6 hours to arrive, and when it did, Jake read it 3 times to make sure he understood correctly. He was ordered to maintain his current mission parameters. A battle group was being dispatched to New Haven and would arrive in approximately 1 week. The Horizon's Edge was not equipped for combat operations and should not engage. Lisa Grant found Jake in his quarters, staring at the wall. She had never seen him like this. The captain was always composed, always diplomatic, always ready with a solution. But right now he looked like a man watching everything he believed in crumble to dust. Lisa sat down next to him and asked what he was thinking. Jake told her he was thinking about how many people would die in the next 7 days while humanity's response slowly got organized. Back on New Haven, the 24-hour deadline expired with no word from Earth. Claire's return message still hadn't arrived. The Galactic Council was holding emergency sessions, but those took time to organize and more time to debate. The Kresh were done waiting. Their fleet moved into attack position and powered up weapons. Claire was on the phone with Greg Palmer when the first missiles launched. She watched through her office window as streaks of light climbed up from the surface toward the orbital platforms. The platforms fired back, and for a few minutes the sky was full of explosions. Then one by one the platforms went dark. The Kresh warships began their bombardment 60 seconds later. The militia fighters launched and did their best. They were brave and skilled and completely outmatched. Claire watched them die on her tactical display, each icon winking out as another pilot was blown out of the sky. Greg Palmer's fighter lasted longer than most. He managed to damage 1 Kresh ship before 3 others converged on him. His last transmission was cut off mid-sentence. The orbital bombardment was precise and devastating. The Kresh weren't trying to destroy the colony completely. They wanted the infrastructure intact so they could move in afterward. But they were very thorough about destroying anything that could resist them. Government buildings, power plants, communication arrays, the spaceport, all of it was reduced to rubble within the first hour. Claire stayed at her post even as the building shook from nearby impacts. She kept broadcasting on every channel, sending out descriptions of what was happening. She wanted someone, anyone, to know the truth. The Kresh weren't just claiming territory. They were murdering colonists who had nowhere to run and no way to fight back. She described the fires spreading through the residential districts. She described the hospital that took a direct hit. She described the school that collapsed while children were still inside. Her last transmission went out just before the administration building was hit. Claire was still talking when the missile struck, still describing what she saw, still believing that someone would hear and someone would care. The building collapsed in sections, each floor pancaking onto the one below. It took 4 minutes for the entire structure to come down. Claire Bennett died somewhere in the middle of that, buried under tons of concrete and steel. The Kresh commander broadcast his victory across the galaxy. He stood on the bridge of his flagship and announced that New Haven was now Kresh territory. He showed footage of the burning colony and declared it proof that humanity's weakness was absolute. Any species that would not defend its own people was not worthy of respect. The Kresh Empire was now accepting claims on all human-surveyed systems. It was first come, first served. Ambassador Peter Cole watched the broadcast in the council chambers. Around him, representatives from 247 species sat in uncomfortable silence. Some looked genuinely shocked. Others seemed quietly satisfied. A few were already making calculations about which human systems they might claim for themselves. The creche had just demonstrated that attacking humanity carried no consequences. Peter stood up slowly. Every eye in the chamber turned to watch him. He walked to the speaking floor without asking for recognition. His footsteps echoed in the silence. When he reached the center, he turned to face Warlord Thex. The creche commander stood tall, confident, victorious. Peter's voice was quiet, but every word carried through the chamber's acoustics. He told them they should have stopped this. He told them they should have stopped the creche years ago when the pattern first became clear. But they didn't because they thought humanity would accept anything to keep the peace. He paused and looked around at all the faces, all the species who had stood by and watched. Then Peter told them they were right. Humanity would have accepted anything. They would have given up New Haven and 100 systems after it. They would have retreated to Earth itself if that was what keeping the peace required. But the creche had made a mistake. They killed those people. They broadcast their murders across the galaxy. And in doing so, they killed the one thing that kept humanity peaceful. Peter walked toward the exit. At the door, he stopped and looked back at the chamber. His last words were delivered with absolute certainty. The galaxy was about to learn what humans were like when they stopped being patient. Then he left and the chamber erupted into chaos behind him. The message from Earth reached every human ship, station, and colony simultaneously. It was short and used language that left no room for interpretation. All military personnel were to report to their designated assembly points immediately. All reserve units were activated. All diplomatic missions were suspended. The message ended with 3 words that no one had heard Earth use in 200 years. We are responding. Admiral Kevin Scott had been waiting for this order his entire career. He stood in the command center of Naval Station Titan and watched the plot board light up as ships began reporting in. For 100 years, humanity had been playing a very patient game. They joined the Galactic Council as peaceful explorers. They built a small defense fleet that looked adequate for protecting trade routes. They signed treaties limiting their military expansion. And the whole time, they were building something else entirely. The shipyards in the Oort cloud came online first. These facilities had been listed in official records as deep space research stations. They were research stations in the same way that a sword was a piece of metal. 70 dreadnoughts emerged from concealed hangars, their reactor cores warming up for the first time. Each ship was twice the size of anything the Galactic Council had ever seen from humanity. Their weapon systems were based on technology that Earth had been very careful never to demonstrate in public. Next came the carrier groups that had been decommissioned 30 years ago. Except they hadn't really been decommissioned. They had been placed in cold storage at facilities scattered throughout the outer system. Now those facilities were warming up their charges, running system checks and loading fighter craft. 16 carrier groups, each one capable of projecting power across an entire sector. Admiral Scott watched the numbers climb on his display. Frigates, destroyers, cruisers, support vessels, all of them appearing from places the galaxy didn't know existed. Within 48 hours, he had a fleet of over 3,000 warships ready for combat operations. It was 10 times larger than what any single species in the Galactic Council could field. It was 20 times larger than what the Council thought humanity possessed. Commodore Helen Price was one of the first senior officers to arrive at the assembly point. Her daughter had been a teacher on New Haven. The girl was 26 years old and had spent the last transmission telling her mother not to worry, that everything would be fine. Helen had listened to that message exactly once and then locked it away where she would never have to hear it again. Now she stood on the bridge of the carrier Defiant and waited for orders that would let her do something useful with her grief. Captain Jake Morrison brought the Horizon's Edge into the fleet 3 days after the mobilization order. His exploration vessel looked tiny next to the military ships surrounding it, but Jake had volunteered immediately. His ship had been refitted with military-grade weapons in a process that took all of 18 hours. The weapons had been in storage, already configured to match his ship's systems. Humanity had been planning for this possibility for a very long time. Lisa Grant watched the transformation of their ship with mixed feelings. She had spent 6 years avoiding fights and now they were actively seeking one, but she had also watched the footage from New Haven, and she understood that some things couldn't be negotiated. When Jake asked if she was ready to serve as tactical officer, she said yes without hesitation. The Kresh response to Earth's mobilization was exactly what Admiral Scott expected. They sent one battle group to crush the human response before it could organize. Warlord Thex personally commanded the operation because he wanted to be present when humanity's bluff was called. He brought his flagship and 37 of the finest warships in the Kresh fleet. They dropped out of hyperspace at the rally point expecting to find scattered human vessels in disarray. Instead, they found Admiral Scott waiting with 600 warships in perfect battle formation. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. The Kresh battle group never had a chance. Their shields, which were supposed to be state-of-the-art, collapsed under weapons fire that hit 3 times harder than anything in the Galactic Council database. Their armor, which had withstood every previous conflict, was sliced through by beam weapons operating on frequencies their sensors couldn't even detect. Warlord Thex died when his flagship was cut in half by a sustained barrage from 3 dreadnoughts. His last transmission was a call for reinforcement that nobody would answer in time. The 37 ships under his command were destroyed with 0 human casualties. Admiral Scott didn't even slow down. The fleet jumped to hyperspace while the wreckage was still glowing. News of the battle spread through the galaxy faster than light. Every species that had access to FTL communication heard about it within hours. The Kresh Empire, which had ruled through military might for 1,000 years, had just lost an entire battle group in 11 minutes. Against humans, against the species that everyone thought was too peaceful to fight. Panic set in across Kresh space. System governors started calling the homeworld demanding to know what was happening. Military commanders scrambled their forces and sent urgent requests for reinforcements. The Kresh High Command activated every reserve unit and recalled every ship from patrol duty. They were assembling the largest military fleet in their history, all of it converging on the homeworld of Threxia Prime. The Galactic Council held emergency sessions that lasted around the clock. Species that had been quietly supportive of Kresh expansion were suddenly very concerned about galactic peace. Representatives who had sat silent while humanity was pushed around now gave speeches about the importance of restraint and dialogue. Ambassador Peter Cole wasn't present at any of these sessions. He had returned to Earth and nobody knew where he was. What they didn't know was that Peter was standing next to Admiral Scott, watching the fleet prepare for its next jump. Earth had sent him back to Naval Station Titan with new orders. He was no longer an ambassador. That role required diplomacy, and Earth was done with diplomacy. Peter was now attached to the fleet as a civilian observer, which meant he would be present when they delivered humanity's response to New Haven. The Kresh sent a formal request for ceasefire negotiations through every diplomatic channel they could access. They offered to withdraw from disputed territories. They offered reparations. They offered to submit to Galactic Council arbitration. The requests were sent to Earth, to the fleet, to any human authority that might listen. Admiral Scott's response was broadcast on every frequency the galaxy used. His message was recorded from the bridge of his flagship, with 3,000 warships visible in formation behind him. He looked directly into the camera and spoke in a voice that carried no anger, no emotion, just absolute certainty. He told the Kresh that humanity had given them 200 years of patience. Now they had 24 hours to withdraw from every system they had taken through force or intimidation. After that deadline passed, the human fleet would be coming through. The message included coordinates and timestamps. The fleet would be jumping to Threxia Prime in exactly 24 hours. They would arrive whether the Kresh withdrew or not. What happened after they arrived would depend entirely on whether the Kresh were still there. Species across the galaxy began evacuating systems along the projected warpath. Nobody wanted to be anywhere near the route the human fleet would take. Some species armed themselves, uncertain whether humanity would stop with the Kresh. Others tried to position themselves as mediators, hoping to broker a peace deal before the shooting started. The Kresh refused to withdraw. 1,000 years of ruling through strength had made them incapable of showing weakness. They positioned their entire fleet at Threxia Prime and prepared to defend their homeworld. Every ship they possessed, every weapon they could deploy, all of it waiting for the humans to arrive. 24 hours and 30 seconds after Admiral Scott's message, the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at Threxia Prime. They came in perfect formation, 3,000 warships moving as one. No more warnings were issued. No more chances were offered. The time for talking was over, and everyone in the galaxy was watching to see what humanity looked like when patience finally snapped. The Battle of Threxia Prime began without any formal declaration or final warning. Admiral Scott's fleet emerged from hyperspace in attack formation and immediately opened fire. The Kresh had assembled every warship they possessed around their homeworld, over 2,000 vessels arranged in defensive layers. It was the largest concentration of military power the Kresh Empire had ever deployed in one location. Against any other opponent in galactic history, it would have been an unbreakable defense. The human dreadnoughts fired first. Their main guns had been designed in secret over decades of careful research. They used a combination of technologies that no other species had thought to merge together. The beams that lanced out from those weapons hit the Kresh shields and punched through them like they were made of paper. Entire warships vanished in explosions that lit up the space around Threxia Prime. Commodore Helen Price commanded the carrier group that broke through the first defensive line. She sat in the command chair of the Defiant and watched her tactical display with cold precision. Her daughter's face kept trying to surface in her mind, but Helen pushed it down. There would be time for grief later. Right now, she had a job to do. She gave the order, and 200 fighter craft launched from her carrier group. The fighters moved through the Kresh formation like sharks through a school of fish. They were faster than anything the Kresh had encountered before. Their weapon systems locked onto targets with accuracy that seemed impossible. Within minutes, they had destroyed the orbital defense platforms that protected the planet. The platforms were massive structures that had taken years to build, and they were reduced to debris in less time than it took to describe what was happening. Captain Jake Morrison led his squadron against the Kresh flagship. The massive warship was trying to coordinate the defense, but the human attack had come so fast that coordination was becoming impossible. Jake's Horizon's Edge was small compared to the military vessels around it, but what it lacked in size it made up for in speed. Lisa Grant sat at the tactical station and called out targeting solutions with the efficiency of someone who had spent years studying how to avoid fights and now understood exactly where to strike to end them. The squadron hit the flagship from 3 directions simultaneously. Their weapons carved through the ship's armor and knocked out its main reactor. The flagship went dark and began drifting. Its escort vessels tried to close ranks, but they were already engaged with other human ships. The Kresh were learning a hard lesson about fighting an opponent that had spent centuries preparing for this exact scenario. The battle lasted 6 hours. For the Kresh, it felt like 6 years. They had never experienced losses like this. Their shields failed. Their weapons couldn't lock onto targets that moved too fast. Their communications were jammed by systems they couldn't detect, let alone counter. Every advantage they thought they possessed turned out to be worthless against technology that Earth had been developing in secret while playing the role of peaceful explorers. 3 hours into the battle, the Kresh commander sent a surrender offer. He broadcast on every channel that he wanted to negotiate a ceasefire. He offered to withdraw all Kresh forces from human territory immediately. He offered reparations and promised that the attack on New Haven had been unauthorized by the central government. It was all lies and everyone knew it, but the commander was desperate. Admiral Scott's response was simple and direct. He told them that humanity remembered how to negotiate. They had spent 2 centuries doing nothing but negotiating. They had negotiated away systems and resources and pride. They had accepted insults and provocations and territorial violations. But they had decided they didn't want to negotiate anymore. The battle would continue until the Kresh military capacity was eliminated. The orbital bombardment of Kresh military infrastructure began in the 4th hour of the battle. Human ships identified every military installation on Threxia Prime and targeted them with precision strikes. Shipyards that had been building warships for centuries were destroyed. Military academies where generations of Kresh warriors had trained were reduced to rubble. Naval bases that housed entire fleets were wiped from the surface. Not a single civilian structure was touched. Every strike hit exactly what it was aimed at and nothing else. The Kresh population watched from their cities as their military power was systematically dismantled. They had been told for generations that their empire was invincible. They had been taught that military might was the only thing that mattered in the galaxy. Now they watched that belief burn in orbital bombardments that lit up their sky like a second sun. By the 5th hour, organized Kresh resistance had collapsed. Individual ships were still fighting, but there was no coordination and no hope of victory. Captains who had served with distinction for decades were making the choice between dying for an empire that had already lost or surrendering to an enemy they had been taught to despise. Most chose to surrender. Some chose to fight until their ships were destroyed. Admiral Scott respected both choices equally and treated surrendered vessels with dignity while destroying those that continued to resist. The 6th hour saw the last Kresh warship either surrender or be destroyed. The fleet that had assembled to defend Threxia Prime was gone. Some ships had been captured intact. Others were nothing but debris fields. The Kresh Empire's military power had been built over 1,000 years, and it had been broken in a single afternoon. Admiral Scott sent a message to the surface demanding that the Kresh government surrender unconditionally. He gave them 1 hour to respond. The response came in 30 minutes. The Kresh High Council agreed to all terms. They would withdraw from every system they had occupied. They would submit to human oversight. They would pay reparations. They would do whatever Earth demanded if the bombardment would stop. But the human fleet didn't stop at Threxia Prime. Admiral Scott had his orders, and those orders were clear. Every system the Kresh had taken through intimidation and force would be liberated. Every species they had subjugated would be freed. The campaign that followed would cover 1/4 of the galaxy, and it would continue until the job was finished. Commodore Price took her carrier group to the systems where Kresh governors had ruled through fear. She gave each governor the same choice: withdraw peacefully or be removed by force. Most chose to withdraw. A few tried to fight, and their defenses lasted about as long as morning dew. Helen watched each system liberation with satisfaction but never joy. Her daughter was still dead, and no amount of victory would change that. Captain Morrison's squadron moved through the border territories, freeing human colonies that had been under Kresh occupation. In some systems, they found colonists who had been forced to work as laborers. In others, they found empty settlements where populations had been relocated. Jake documented everything because he knew this evidence would matter later, when the galaxy asked questions about humanity's response. The campaign lasted 3 months. 3 months of jumping from system to system. 3 months of offering surrender terms and then enforcing them when they were refused. 3 months of dismantling an empire that had stood for a millennium. The human fleet moved with efficiency that bordered on mechanical. They were angry, but they weren't cruel. They destroyed military targets and freed occupied populations, and treated prisoners according to protocols that many species didn't even know humans possessed. Back at the Galactic Council Station, Ambassador Peter Cole's office was flooded with communications. Every species in the council wanted to talk. The ones who had quietly supported the Kresh now wanted to condemn them. The ones who had remained neutral wanted to mediate. The ones who had always been friendly wanted to help. Peter listened to each message with the same neutral expression and responded to none of them. What he did respond to was a message from a small species called the Venthi. They had been conquered by the Kresh 60 years ago and lived under occupation ever since. Their representative sent a simple message thanking humanity for their liberation. Peter responded immediately and told them they were welcome. It was the first diplomatic communication he had sent since the fleet deployed. The 3-month campaign ended when the last Kresh-occupied system was liberated. Admiral Scott assembled the fleet at a rally point and sent a message to Earth. The mission was complete. The Kresh Empire was shattered. Every system they had taken was now free. He was requesting permission to bring the fleet home. The response from Earth came 12 hours later. Permission granted. Well done, come home. The human fleet returned to Earth in stages over the course of 2 weeks. Admiral Scott came home last, as was tradition, and found a planet that had changed in ways both visible and invisible. There were no parades or celebrations waiting for him. The victory over the Kresh had cost 0 human military lives, but the 4,000 dead on New Haven weighed heavy on everyone. Earth had not fought to win glory. They had fought because they were finally pushed too far, and now that the pushing was over, they wanted to go back to the peace they had always preferred. The Kresh Empire was reduced to 3 systems under human oversight. A single monitoring station orbited their homeworld, staffed by a rotating crew of 50 personnel. The station's commander was a young officer named Carl Hughes, who had specific orders about his mission. He was there to ensure the Kresh rebuilt peacefully and didn't start threatening their neighbors again. He was not there to punish or humiliate. Earth wanted the Kresh to learn from what happened, not to suffer endlessly for it. Commodore Helen Price oversaw the establishment of that monitoring station and then submitted her resignation from active duty. Her service record was impeccable, and the Navy tried to convince her to stay, but Helen was done. She had led her carrier group through the entire campaign and completed every mission with precision. Now her daughter was still dead and she needed time away from the military to figure out what her life looked like without her. The Navy accepted her resignation with full honors, and Helen returned to her family's farm in the countryside where she could grieve in private. Captain Jake Morrison received orders to resume his exploration missions. The Horizon's Edge was refitted back to its original configuration, and Jake was told to go back to mapping star systems and making peaceful contact with new species. He accepted the orders because they made sense, but something had changed. Lisa Grant noticed it first. Jake was quieter now. He still commanded with the same competence, but the easy confidence from before was gone. He had seen what humanity was capable of when pushed, and it had altered something fundamental in how he viewed the galaxy. The Galactic Council called an emergency summit and demanded that every species attend. The council chambers were packed with representatives who all wanted to know the same thing. What did humanity want? They had just demonstrated military power that exceeded anything the council thought existed. They had destroyed an empire that had ruled for 1,000 years. They could demand territory, resources, tribute, anything they wanted. The galaxy was waiting to find out what price humanity would extract for 2 centuries of patience. Ambassador Peter Cole returned to the council chambers for the first time since New Haven burned. He walked to the speaking floor in silence, and the entire chamber held its breath. Every species represented there had spent the past 3 months watching humanity dismantle the Kresh and wondering if they would be next. Peter stood in the center of the floor and looked around at all the faces watching him. Then he began to speak in a voice that carried clearly through the vast space. He told them that humanity had not wanted any of this. He reminded them that Earth had spent 2 centuries proving that coexistence was possible. They had absorbed insults that would have started wars between other species. They had accepted treaties that favored everyone but themselves. They had given up systems and resources and pride. All of it had been done to demonstrate that strength did not have to mean violence, and that patience was not the same as weakness. But the galaxy had seen humanity's patience and decided it meant humans were soft. The Kresh had pushed and pushed because they believed humanity would accept anything to avoid conflict. They were right. Humanity would have accepted anything. They would have retreated to Earth itself if that was what peace required. The Kresh had made only one mistake, but it was fatal. They killed 4,000 colonists and broadcast the massacre as proof of human weakness. Peter paused and let the silence stretch. Then he continued in the same quiet voice. Those deaths killed something in humanity. They killed the belief that patience would eventually be rewarded. They killed the hope that the galaxy valued peace as much as humans did. And once those beliefs were dead, what remained was a species that had been preparing for war, while everyone thought they were preparing for peace. He told the council about the shipyards that had operated in secret for a century. He told them about the weapons research that had continued even while humanity was signing arms limitation treaties. He told them about the military academies that trained officers in tactics that would never be used unless absolutely necessary. All of it had existed as insurance against the day when patience was no longer enough. That day came at New Haven, and the galaxy saw what humanity had been hiding. Peter wanted them to understand that the military power they witnessed was not new. It had been there all along. Humanity had simply chosen not to use it until every other option was exhausted. The Kresh forced that choice and paid the price, but the lesson should not be lost on anyone else present. Then Peter told them what would happen next. Humanity was going home. They were keeping their fleet because clearly the galaxy needed to know it existed, but Earth had no interest in empire or domination. They did not want tribute or territory or control. They wanted to go back to exploring and trading and existing peacefully alongside everyone else. The 3,000 warships would return to reserve status just as they had been before. But Peter made one thing absolutely clear. Humanity would never again accept what happened at New Haven. Not to humans and not to any species too small to defend itself. If another empire rose up and started conquering its neighbors, humanity would stop them. If species were enslaved or massacred, humanity would intervene. Earth was done watching the strong prey on the weak while everyone pretended diplomacy would solve everything. The council chamber remained silent for a long moment after Peter finished speaking. Then the representative from the Venthi, the species liberated from Kresh occupation, stood and began to applaud. Others joined slowly until the entire chamber was filled with the sound. It was not applause for victory or conquest. It was recognition that something fundamental had shifted in galactic politics. Peter left the chamber without waiting for formal dismissal. He had said what needed saying, and staying to debate fine points seemed pointless. Outside the council chambers, he found a private observation deck and stood looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there was a debris field that used to be New Haven. 4,000 people were dead, and no amount of military victory would bring them back. Peter wondered if they would have approved of what Earth did in response. He wanted to believe they would have, but he would never know for certain. Back on Earth, construction began on a memorial for the New Haven victims. It was built on a hillside overlooking the ocean, and carved with the name of every person who died. The memorial included a simple inscription that read, "They wanted peace. We gave them patience. When patience was not enough, we gave them justice." People came from across human space to stand before that wall of names and remember what had been lost. The galaxy settled into a new reality over the following years. The Kresh rebuilt slowly under human oversight. Their new government was democratic, and their military was limited to system defense forces. A generation grew up knowing that their empire had fallen not because humans were stronger, but because they had been patient until patience was no longer an option. Some resented humanity for their defeat. Others appreciated that Earth could have done far worse but chose restraint even in victory. Other species adjusted their behavior in subtle ways. Territorial disputes that might have escalated into conflict were suddenly resolved through negotiation. Species that had relied on military intimidation found their threats no longer carried the same weight. Everyone understood that humanity was watching and would respond if things went too far. It was not the peace that Earth had originally wanted, but it was a more honest peace than what had existed before. Captain Morrison discovered a new habitable world 6 months after the campaign ended. He named it Haven's Hope. The first colonists arrived a year later and built their settlement under the protection of a naval station that would ensure New Haven's fate never repeated itself. Claire Bennett's name was given to the capital city. The settlers planted gardens and built schools and raised families. Life continued because that was what humans did. They survived and they built and they hoped for better tomorrows. Admiral Scott retired from active service and took a position teaching strategy at the Naval Academy. His students asked him questions about the campaign, and he answered honestly. But the lesson he emphasized most was not about tactics or weapons or force projection. It was about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. He told them that humanity's greatest strength was not the fleet they built in secret. It was the 200 years of patience that preceded it. Any species could start a war. It took real strength to avoid one. Ambassador Peter Cole remained at his post for another decade before retiring. He spent those years rebuilding relationships and proving that humanity's diplomatic nature had not been destroyed by what happened.